There, I see you're starting it now. Excellent. So I put together a couple of questions just to kind of get people thinking about what, how to present what they're talking about on the panel. And the first one about what's changed in how intelligent decision services are used in the real world. As Jacob said at the beginning of the day, our focus this week is on intelligent decision services. And I don't mean to really focus on what's happened in the last 18 months, but we have gone through a lot of disruption in the last 18 months. And so although your stories about what has changed don't have to be specific to the pandemic, I expect that we're going to hear some pandemic stories in here. So that's the kind of to start off, just how are you seeing things change in the intelligent decision services in the real world? And then secondly, what do you see are the most important trends that are starting to happen and you kind of think need to happen over the next maybe 3 to 4 years? So let's start, Bob, let's start with you. And if we can just kind of go through I'm just going to go through this is the order that Jacob gave you the names in, and it's the order they're on the website. So that's the order we're going in.
Okay, so
we can just start and maybe actually start with just a quick introduction to yourself as well, just like 30 seconds. So anybody who doesn't know.
Okay, so I've been working with decision systems since 1989. Although technically I haven't actually been doing very much with decision systems over the last 2 or 3 years. I've kind of become involuntarily retired, partly due to health issues and partly because I couldn't be bothered to try looking for anything else during the COVID situation. So to a certain extent, my perception of the way that intelligent decision services are going is probably more from the perspective of an outsider rather than an insider. But I guess the sort of impression that I get is that we seem to be trying to build more of these intelligent decision services to use in the real world. But at the same time, there's a very disturbing trend, social trend, I think, for people to start disputing the validity of evidence-based systems and statistics and various sorts of things, which means that trust in these sorts of systems is probably going to be low. And so whether it's going to be a future trend or not, I think one of the very important things that the decision management community and a lot of other people who are essentially trying to build decision services which give reliable and trustworthy results, fight to essentially get the reputation of these things to the point where people are generally going to be happy to use them.
So kind of just as we get the technology to the point where it can do things, there's these sort of societal influences that we're having people not want to use them anymore.
I think, I mean, things like the anti-vax kind of movement is, and various other sorts of trends like, stealing the election and so on, which, I mean, from an outsider, I think the rest of the world was just incredulous at some of the things that happened sort of between the time of the election and the inauguration. But I think the thing is that is something which we are involved with, because we are trying to build systems which are based on evidence and are going to give advice to people. And we have to make sure that those systems give good advice. But even if we have a system that's giving good advice, we want people to feel that they can take it.
That's a really good point. It's I think that's, like you say, it's just we have to get people to accept those decisions as well. Okay, all right, good. Mark, why don't we move on to you, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself and just sort of how you think about these two questions. And oh, just by the way, for everybody else, we're going to be opening it up for Q&A. So kind of think of the questions that you want to ask to the panel or to specific people on the panel. And either you can raise your hand on Zoom and ask it yourself, or just type it in Slack and then I'll ask it. So Mark, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Sandy. So I am Mark Woods. I lead the Decision Modeling Center of Excellence at Allstate Insurance Company in North America. And when I think about the things that have changed in the real world, I'm looking at it from a much shorter term perspective than some of the people here. We've only been engaged with decision modeling for a few years, maybe a half dozen years at Allstate. But some of the things I'm seeing that have changed over that time are a greater acceptance of decision modeling as a valid practice in the software development space. No longer do I spend as much time as I used to with programmers and data scientists alike, trying to convince them that decision models are a really good way to develop software and are very complementary to the predictive modelers that our data scientists are so focused on. I think this is going to be one of the big trends that we're seeing, at least within our space in the future, is a combination of decision models with predictive models to yield better results for the company, as well as better results for our customers. Another trend that I see emerging recently, as we get this greater acceptance of decision modeling as a valid approach, is a recognition that as we're embracing model-based development, we need to be thinking about how we're going to manage all this stuff. We have a growing inventory of models, not just decision models, but predictive models, business process models, APIs, and encoded functions that we're developing for our solutions. And we need a holistic way to manage all of these things, to understand where these different components are being used and in what kind of way they're being used.
Yeah, I think that's really valid. It's like, especially like you say, that managing the different models and so on. And we were talking this morning when Alan's presentation this morning about just when you're using multiple model types, like how do you know when to use one or the other? How do you jump around from one to another and so on? And that's a problem that I see in my practice, is like working with large enterprise customers, where it's like, well, okay, you could do this little thing in a decision model, or you could do it within your process model. And then you have to have people be able to jump between the different model types. And then, like you say, managing and versioning and so on. So yeah, I think that's going to be an important challenge, is to look at like this BPM plus sort of vision of all these different model types that we're working with. Okay, great. James, you want to chime in with your thoughts on these initial questions? Unmute, James.
You muted me, so no, I didn't mute myself. Anyway, to Mark's point, I mean, we've been using decision modeling now on client projects for about a decade, right? We started when Alan published his book, and then we've been doing it ever since. And I would say, as Mark said, I spend a lot less time arguing with people that it's a good idea, which is all to the good. I think there is still an enormous challenge getting more people to use it, but it is definitely less problematic to argue with people these days. So what's changed how they use? What I would say is I see it broadening its use cases. When I started this, back at FICO 20 years ago, we talked about decision management. Really, the only people who thought about decisions explicitly were in financial services, retail credit. And part of what decision modeling has really enabled is people who are not in that space to think explicitly about decisions and start thinking about decision services as an artifact. And I think we see people doing all sorts of different kinds of models now, decision models for all sorts of different kinds of decisions. And I think that's really an important trend, right? That we're no longer just doing this for credit risk or for fraud or for things that we might regard as traditional use cases for decision services, but we're starting to do things for very day-to-day operational, dispatchy, truck drivey kind of things that are much more sort of real. So I think that's good. In terms of future trends, I agree with Mark that the intersection of machine learning and AI and predictive analytics with more explicit kinds of declarative logic, I think is a key trend. I think we're beginning to see more people adopt that. There's still a depressingly large number of machine learning and AI people who are throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but as none of them can get their stuff into production, they probably don't really matter in the long run because they're just going to do pilots and prototypes and spend a ton of money, and they won't ever actually get anything working. So we can probably ignore them. But the ones who are serious, I think, seeing it as a combination. But I think what's going to change there is we're beginning to see machine learning practitioners see decision modeling not just as a way, and decision services, not just as a way to operationalize their model, but to actually do the requirements for their model. Actually, when you get to the sort of the first step in a machine learning project, and you have to decide what kind of model you're going to build. If you look at some of the people like Cassie at Google and other sort of thinkers on decision intelligence and decision, the sort of decision-centric view of machine learning, there's a real sense that you really have to understand the decision that you're trying to improve with machine learning before you start. And I think that's going to drive a whole new set of practitioners into thinking about decisions and decision models more explicitly. And I think that's perhaps the most exciting trend we see, is that it's not just about sort of rules people saying, hey, this is a great way for you to finish your machine learning project, but a great way to start it.
No, that's a good point. And I think thinking about that bigger picture there is an important part of it. So unfortunately, there must have been a scheduling issue with Carol Ann, because she was scheduled to be on here according to Jacob, but she's not here. So why don't we move on to you, Jan?
Hello. For those who don't know me, my name is Jan Purchase. I run a consultancy called Lux Magi, and we specialize, and have done now for about 8 or 9 years, on delivering machine learning based data-driven decisions. And to echo some of James's points, I think what we're seeing and I started to see accelerate during the pandemic, I don't know if there's any correlation, I doubt it, is that intelligent decision-making systems are becoming more intelligent. And that is to say that clients are being more adventurous in the sophistication of the machine learning model types that they are incorporating into decision-making. They are using decision modeling as a way of increasing the robustness of these models by a process that we like to call caging. In other words, by taking a machine learning model potentially with some known defects or problems, and using decision modeling to create ensembles of complementary either declarative logic or machine learning models that bolster each other's robustness and that cover each other in different parts of the manifold, if you like. So this is a trend that we hope continues. We also see more companies using the combination of declarative logic and machine learning inside decision models to process unstructured input, text being a key a case in point. And something that we've engaged with first, and I hope is a trend, is people using clients using decision models to adjust the results and the behavior of machine learning models to bias out or debias any data set induced skew that machine learning models sometimes have, especially when their initial testing and the models they are using are somewhat famous for these issues.
That's interesting points, Jan. It's like I'm contrasting what you're saying about the decision services becoming more intelligent with what Bob was saying about how in some cases there's a little bit of a backlash to people saying, you know, who don't want to see evidence-based things, but are sort of leery of like, oh, there's this automated thing that's making decisions in here. Are you seeing any of that sort of sense?
You know, that's making people more, that's making some clients initially more apprehensive, particularly the bias issue. They've been bombarded with stories of institutionalized bias in well-known data sets which are used to train models, particularly.
Hey, I'm a woman in technology. I understand.
Exactly, right. So you know that practically every single NLP model out there has got some hideous bias. But I think,
right.
to be honest, I think they can be convinced that this fairness issue and the robustness issue, two of the key problems, can be addressed by the kind of structure that decision models bring. And to echo James's point, it also really does help to anchor your use of machine learning to concrete business goals in the beginning. It's astounding to me that some of the projects I've heard of just seem to miss this quite elementary step and got rather carried away. So I think I'm a bit more optimistic, perhaps wrongly so. I think, to be fair though, I think there's one very good point. It's about public acceptance of these systems. I think that's a different issue. What clients are prepared to do and what the public will accept are two different things. And it could be the skepticism we're seeing will persist in the public.
And I think that's more, Bob, that was kind of more what you were.
Yeah, no, that was really the point I was making, Jan. I mean, I think that there's a lot more acceptance within business for using things like decision service approaches to doing things, and there's an understanding, I think, now that you need to, the machine learning is only part of the sort of solution steps that you need to make in order to get these things working. My concern is more, as I say, really kind of taking an outside view of being, the person who is the victim or the beneficiary of these things being in place within the organizations that I interact with.
And this is where I think equal error parity models will add a lot of value, because they can help to
if the general public actually understands what that means.
Well, okay, but essentially it's a provable way of showing that you're disadvantaging groups of people uniformly rather than being skewed. And, but you're right, the test of whether they accept that or not, especially given their reluctance with regard to accepting statistics, is another matter, perhaps.
Okay, let's bring Nick into the conversation. Nick, just if you want to kind of take a look at those two questions I posed, what are your thoughts on those?
Hi, thanks, Sandy. Bit of an intro to myself then. I'm currently a management consultant for Baringa Partners. My specialty over the last few years has been in agile ways of working. I've been involved with decision management initiatives since 2013. Probably my most recent flirtation with decision management in anger was the DecisionCAMP webinar from a couple of months back, where I was looking at how you actually combine decision modeling practices in an agile delivery model. So in terms of the two questions, my focus, I think, very much is really the outcomes that I've seen driven through the use of intelligent decision services. So I think primarily what I've seen over the last couple of years, maybe longer, is actually the desire of businesses to reduce and mitigate their risks and issues in real time. So James mentioned like the truck routing kind of thing. My last couple of industries have been oil and gas and logistics. So, having seen the importance that businesses are putting on things like real-time route diversions to accommodate for road traffic accidents, or looking at engineers putting an emergency stop on a drilling operation. That's the kind of thing where, although understanding historic trends is obviously still massively important, and it supports longer term planning, it provides input to predictive models. The fact that people want to be able to course correct, it's a game changer that I've seen for a lot of industries. So I think that's, having done, let's say, MI projects spanning back a couple of decades where everything was on the, what happened yesterday, what happened last week, that ability to consume and process and act on real-time data, I think, has been one of the big things that I've seen change.
Yeah, because it's in the pandemic, we don't exactly have data for like, oh, well, when this happened last year, it's like, well, the year before it started, it had never happened before, like within the kind of the lifetime that we were dealing with the technology that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and that fundamentally changed. The last client that I was with, suddenly when they were specifying the stuff that they wanted, they were like, well, normally we would do a year-on-year comparison, but what's the point? Right. You know, what are we going to compare it to? What's that actually going to tell us? So, you know, they moved it far more to, well, what are the things that we can actually do to address the potential risks to the customer experience through what's going wrong right now? And then essentially, you know, that historic stuff becomes something that you can use more for longer term planning rather than actual diagnosis of shorter term problems. Then the other stuff that I've seen is particularly, as I mentioned, because I'm with an oil and gas client at the moment, how people are using machine learning to give a more accurate picture of the gaps in the things that they can't see and therefore reach decisions faster. So if, for example, you look at how machine learning has been adopted within seismic image processing, where they're actually trying to determine the faults in the Earth's surface, they're using machine learning to actually enhance the quality of that imagery and therefore be able to, you know, ascertain, is it worth us, you know, whatever your thoughts are around oil and gas aside, you know, is that actually going to give us the opportunity to get more oil? But then probably underlying all of that is an enhanced consideration of data as a first-class asset, by which I mean, you know, you can have all of the models that you want over the top, but ultimately there's been a huge shift in people, you know, adopting data services, you know, a data foundation that provides governed and trusted data that is a reusable asset across an entire organization, because then they know that whatever decisions are made, they can put greater trust in, which comes all the way back to Bob's point right at the start, I think.
Right.
And then in terms of future trends, I'm going to stick kind of with the outcomes side of it. So I think for me, the most important future trends will be around predicting the impact of climate change. I think that's kind of where I see a lot of this stuff coming together. You know, we're moving to a low carbon economy, and I think it's just the decisions that will drive generally. So that's not just, you know, it's going to be the impact on financial assets as a result of it, or our method of travel. You know, there's so much that people will start paying attention to because, you know, climate change models are becoming, you know, the thing for people to take notice of. So that for me, I think, is where some of the biggest trends will come from in terms of the usage of decision services.
Okay, great points. Okay, we have a hand raised in the audience. Alexander, you can go ahead. You can unmute yourself. You can show your video too if you like, or okay,
yeah, no, I'm a bit sick, so I'm drinking my hot tea in my pajamas. So not going to.
Oh, come on, we want to see that.
Face. No, it's fine. So first of all, thank you for the insightful comments on the questions. I would guess my question contains of two parts. So my first question is towards you as people who are inside this domain for a while and who are actually working still on it, is how intelligent do you think the decision systems should actually become? Like, should there be a limit on that? And then following up on that, I assume that, for example, in the European Union, there is already a limit imposed, right, with the GDPR. So I was wondering how far the governments in your concerning countries would actually allow the decision services to become as intelligent. And then following up in a similar manner on that question is, which decisions should then be kept purely to a human level then?
The regulation of, I think it was Elon Musk's video that I saw not that long ago. I don't know how long ago he actually gave the interview, but he was talking about how, you know, he'd been lobbying for how do you regulate AI in particular, you know, how do you actually make sure that the growth of that doesn't outstrip well, whatever is acceptable. And he kind of laid it at the door of, he said, well, that is the problem with smart people. You know, they don't necessarily understand the limit of their own intelligence and therefore struggle to believe that anything could go beyond it.
So was he talking about himself here, or just?
No, I'm not really sure.
Okay.
He's always talking.
Who knows?
About himself,
he's on a different level, isn't he? So, but yeah. So I think I think there's a fairly fundamental question there around how you end up. You know, what decisions do you make to decide whether or not that kind of thing gets regulated or not? Which I have not got a succinct answer for, but I think it's something that's definitely going to hopefully hit us so that we can deal with it proactively, or it'll be too late, in which case doesn't matter.
Well, it is a challenge, and that's a multinational problem, right? It's not like there's the EU, but then there's like the rest of the world too. So it's everybody's got to have some way that, because businesses work across borders now, like it's you have to have some way to have some, you know, I don't know if we can have any global kind of understanding of this, but it does need to be a little bit broader than just one country.
I want to take. Sorry, go ahead. I want to take his last question first. So. All right, I'll go. All right. So the last question you asked: should we reserve certain decisions for humans only? And I want to I think there's a fundamental misconception that I really want to sort of tackle with that question, which is that there's this sense that decisions have to be either handled by an intelligent decision system or handled by a person. And I think companies that think that way, and organizations that think that way, and God forbid governments that think that way, are going to get themselves into a terrible, terrible hole, right? And the only way to think about this is to think about this as a composite exercise. That just because we model a decision, just because we understand a decision, we understand that we're going to use rules for this piece or declarative logic for that piece, we're going to use machine learning or AI for this piece, we're going to have an algorithm for this piece, doesn't mean that we're not going to use a human for another piece. And when we build decision models, one of the reasons we like them is that we don't have to know whether you're going to automate a decision or how you're going to automate a decision before we can completely specify the decision model. And that's a tremendously powerful asset, that you can have decisions in models. Our most famous one was a medical one where one of the decisions in the model was, does the patient look like they will survive surgery? And one of the IT guys said to me, how are you going to automate that? I said, I'm not going to automate that. I'm going to ask the surgeon. Now, the surgeon has to answer that question, but that's part of the question. Is I sense that you can let people override decisions instead of trying to integrate them into the decisions is a critical error in the way most people design decision services. They think that people should be able to override these things, and that's a big mistake. They have to integrate people into the decision, not allow them to override it. And as long as we allow this sort of random override, you've got to let people override this shit, we will continue to have bias and bigotry everywhere. To Sandy's point, just because the algorithms are biased against women in tech, gosh, anyone would think that the people in the industry weren't, but of course they are too.
No, we understand where the bias comes
this
from.
is adjacent. This is adjacent to the point being made earlier by a presentation earlier today that, and I think it was Bob who raised this question, an excellent one I've discussed with others myself, which is that one of the problems we have is a trust issue caused by a lack of interpretability and a lack of explainability. Do we really think our human colleagues are that much more interpretable or explainable?
Yeah, I think that I mean it's an interesting question, but I think the thing is that we know that some of the AI systems that we have come up with are seriously biased because of the input data, but we equally know that an awful lot of decisions which are made by people are biased as well. We may not be able, we can't go back and actually look at the data which tells us why those people are biased, but we still know that the decisions they're making are biased. You know, there are a lot of
at least we can use machine learning to lower the noise that in the decisions that are made by people.
So I think I mean my kind of view is I don't really see there's any particular reason why we should limit the sorts of decisions that can be made by systems, as long as we basically are making conscious decisions that those those are things which we are going to allow to happen. I mean, I don't. The part of the AI debate, I think, is this sort of idea that the machines are going to take over from us, and that may happen in the future. But I mean, my PhD is in neurophysiology. I know a little bit about how the brain works, and I know enough about how much it works that nobody knows how it works at all. It's just as much a mystery now as it was, sort of 40, 45 years ago when I was doing my research. So I don't think we need to worry about machines taking over. But I think in terms of building systems which make decisions, then if we can, demonstrate that they're making good decisions, that they're making unbiased decisions, there's no particular reason why we shouldn't actually say, no, we don't want people to make those decisions. We'd rather have the machine make them, because it's actually going to make better decisions. It's going to make unbiased decisions. It's going to make decisions we can trust. It's not because they're Democrats or Republicans or they're Labour or Tory or whatever political fractions or other sorts of biases those people might have.
There's an interesting question that Ron has just posed on Slack, which is adjacent to this, which is that, given this sort of skepticism about what's a good decision and what's explainable and so on, should rules-based decision models, which are deterministic, be distinguished from statistical decision models, which may not be purely or fully explainable?
I don't think they're an either-or proposition. I have yet to find a single decision model, not one, that used statistical models that didn't also need to use declarative models. Now, I have found a few compliance-oriented models that only need rules, that don't need any machine learning, though to Jan's point, sometimes machine learning can improve them. So I don't think this is an either-or proposition. I think the key thing here is to be able to use a decision model to not just say, here's a machine learning model, which I may or may not be able to describe its innards, but I can tell you exactly what I did with it and in which circumstances. Here's a score that I generated about Ron and his, let's say his fraud risk. And even if I can't tell you how I came up exactly with that fraud risk, I can demonstrate to you that I didn't turn him down because of it. I just referred him for a conversation with someone because of it. So he was not punished because of this opaque model. So if I can show you what I did with the model and how it impacted you, then I think it can be opaque. It just can't be opaque, and you just can't say, well, I just did it because the machine told me to. Right? That's where it breaks down. And I think the companies are both inept in how they present the stuff. They just say, oh, the machine told us or the system told us, which is obvious nonsense. Or they are too passive about it. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, I think the FICO ran a series of ads promoting credit scoring, because they said good credit doesn't always wear a suit and tie. Because the whole premise was people who get credit from credit officers have to look like the right kind of person. They have to be white, they have to be a man, they've got to wear a suit and tie, and they're not the only people who have good credit. And the data told us that other people had good credit. And I think we have to be both recognizing the skepticism and, to Ron's point, being transparent about what we do with these models. But I think we also have to be more aggressive about saying, people are crappy decision makers. Often they're biased, they're short-circuited, they're tired. Judges make different decisions in the afternoon than they do in the morning. I mean, it's just, if you read Noise, Kahneman's new book on noise, it's terrifying, the variation in human decision making within an organization.
I think that the fundamental thing that I would just build on with what James said is it fundamentally does come down to transparency. If you actually forget the immediate topic we're talking about, all of the, trust comes from being transparent. If I look at any of the stuff I do around agile ways of working and how teams work together, it's all about that trust, and that trust is built through being transparent around what you're doing. And ultimately, any distrust in how we use machine learning or any other thing like that comes down to the fact that people are probably afraid of it. But actually, if you are transparent enough about it, and I know transparent is broad, and it's going to depend how complicated the model is, and it's not going to be transparent to everybody, but it is about, that's how you build trust ultimately.
And there's going to be a problem there, I think, ultimately, when techniques like reinforcement learning come into their own over the next couple of decades, because some of the solutions that you can develop with reinforcement learning will be transparent, but ultimately they'll be so complex that humans won't be able to understand them. So there won't be any duplicity, there won't be any lack of transparency. A strategy will be, these RL algorithms will be able to provide a strategy. It's just that fewer and fewer humans will be able to actually understand what that means.
It's a complexity issue, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why transparency is such a useful but equally not word, because you look at the way that people's habits have changed around how much they need to know about the stuff that they use. So how many people understand how an iPhone works versus their mechanical equivalents decades ago. People are more willing eventually just to let go of the fact that, do you know what, they don't need to know. Now that in itself is a good and a bad thing, but that is ultimately, there's going to be an element of, if there's enough evidence to James's point about, I can demonstrate why this particular thing, why we've come to this particular decision, then that will engender potentially greater trust in, do you know what, I don't need to know the inner guts of that. I've seen enough evidence of good decision making that actually I can just, implicitly trust it.
I think there's also issues to think about in terms of what sorts of decisions we're talking about. I mean, I think a lot of the conversation has been assuming that we're talking about decisions which are made about people, but there are other sorts of decision systems out there. I mean, things like control systems, fly-by-wire on airplanes. They're using decision systems and as the sort of complexity of those sorts of systems increases, we're probably going to end up with decision systems which, as Jan says, they may have actually been developed using algorithms where we don't really quite understand how the system works. But the alternative would be either we don't have the advanced technology, or we use this because people themselves can't actually make the decisions at the right speed in order to keep up with the mechanics of operation. So we're going to have some systems which I think we're going to have to trust because they haven't gone wrong. And in the same way as we've had lots of industrial accidents and disasters which are down to human failure, then we're probably in the future going to have control systems which are run by computers where things are going to go wrong.
I think that's a good point, Bob. It's like
trust in the systems.
And Ron had had a follow-up question just about how do you be transparent about statistical models, and the answer is that you can't be necessarily. But if the results, like you say, the results compared to human decision making in something like fly-by-wire or whatever are so much better, then you're going to use the statistical models, even though you don't necessarily have complete transparency into every decision that was made along the way, because because the human decision making just isn't fast enough or enough of it or whatever.
No, I mean there are certain systems which are for things like image analysis of histology for cancer patients, where the ML systems are much better than the people examining the slides by hand. Now they're still going to make mistakes. They're still going to come up with situations where they come up with false positives, and people will go off for doing tests when there's nothing wrong with them, and they'll come up with false negatives, and people will be undiagnosed and possibly sort of lose their lives as a consequence. But the system that they have that uses the computer is much better than the human one. So yeah, it still makes mistakes, but it makes fewer mistakes, and that's better.
Sure. Okay, let's go over. Sorry, I just want to move on so we can kind of have some other topics. Yeah. So
I was hoping to. Mark wanted to say something, and I felt like he hasn't said anything yet. So.
I was
you want to jump in, Mark? Go ahead.
I really like your point about complexity. Our world is becoming more complex. Our products are becoming more complex. And we have run out of good ways with traditional software techniques to manage that complexity. If nothing else, decision models give us a way to do that, whether they're used in automated processes or, as James mentioned, exercised by a human.
Right. Okay. We're going to go to the audience. Fred Simkin has a question. So if you want to go ahead, Fred.
First of all, I want to thank everybody, all the presentations today, and I want to thank the panel. So many of my heroes are there. Nick, I'm glad to see you do have that flame-proof coat on. What I wanted to ask about today, and I haven't heard a lot about it, although Denny did touch on it, is about the two ends of the process of developing, deploying, and maintaining decision management systems. I'd like to hear from the panel about the front end, about the knowledge analysis piece, and the back end, the knowledge governance piece. On the front, I'd like to hear their thoughts on identifying and bounding the problem domain, identifying sources of domain knowledge, engaging the sources, whether human or not, extracting and organizing the relevant domain knowledge, modeling the domain. How do you decide the appropriate representation schema? Are we going to be talking about rules? Are we going to be talking about case-based reasoning? Are we going to be talking about ANNs, or or some hybrid? How do you validate the content? This is one of my big bugaboos right now. How do you validate? How do you set up a system within the development process to validate the content that you've extracted and captured and modeled? And then using that knowledge to develop a knowledge architecture. Are you going to use inferencing? Are you going to use sequential processing? Are you going to use some hybrid? Then on the back end, how do you design the structures for the client and as part of the project to ensure that the new knowledge, and as Nick probably knows too well, but as somebody who works a lot with people who take a shower after work, I now know, you have examples like the Federal Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement changed well control regulations 9 times in 3 years following the Deepwater Horizon incident. Flow into the application, and the old knowledge that's no longer valid gets deprecated if it needs to be. How do you help clients, or how do you tell clients or help them set up the kinds of roles and responsibilities that ensure that systems adhere to the mantra of complete, consistent, correct, and current, and are living, so that we don't have, the ancient story of Aldo Cimino at Campbell's Soup, with the system becoming totally useless 6 months after he retired because nobody put in a system to maintain it. So long-winded, I apologize. My flame-proof coat is on. You may fire when ready.
So just to paraphrase, it's kind of, how do you make sure that you're getting the right sources of information into the decisions?
Yeah,
and
this is the
how do you make sure?
part. The squishy part of, I still use the old word, knowledge engineering. You can call it decision modeling, whatever you want. I see the DMN as a tool within the process for, and a critical one. But what I'm looking for from this panel of domain experts is, words of wisdom on as we go forward in this. How do we structure this process of identifying really identifying the problem space, identifying the knowledge that I need to capture, validating that knowledge, modeling it correctly, architecting it, and then on the back end, maintaining the application that I've now deployed as a service to the client. How do I ensure that that keeps being a living piece? What are the elements that I need to make a part of the project to ensure that that continues to be a living piece of software valuable to the client.
Okay. Fred, you're never going to make it on Jeopardy, but you know. Okay.
I never will make it on a lot of things.
Mark, could we start with you? I'd be interested in, like, I work with a lot of insurance clients too, and I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, boy, I'm sitting here asking myself, how do we validate that the requirements are accurate? You know, our approach really is you take advantage of the tribal knowledge that you have at the company, and you bring in multiple sources which don't always agree. We rely heavily on our technologists, who tend to understand the detail of how things are implemented and work from that perspective, as well as business experts in both a product design space as well as in a rate making space, to work out how are things supposed to work, how had they envisioned the product to work, and take advantage of those two sometimes competing opinions to drive out what do they want the requirements to be. That's not really a validation approach, but it's the best we've come up with for ascertaining how are these things supposed to work? What are the actual rules?
Otherwise, you just have like a big gladiator match where they fight it out, right?
Yeah. No, I would completely agree with Mark. We find exactly the same thing. We often we're trying to start with a blank piece of paper essentially and say, well, how do you decide? How do you think you should decide? How do you want to decide? How are you supposed to decide? And really try and capture that. And to Fred's point, the decision model, you know, is the thing. It's the thing that says what the scope is. It's the thing that says what the business domain knowledge is. It's the thing that captures the domain expertise as they go. We have clients who are like, oh, well, we're not quite ready to do a decision model yet. Can we have a couple of weeks to write a requirements document? And we're like, no, we don't want you to write a requirements document. We want you to come to the session and build a decision model with us, because we don't want to have a requirements document. We want to have a decision model, right? So I think it's a fundamentally different artifact in our experience. You can build it directly with business people, as Mark said, and you get a completely different experience than all the previous modeling approaches we've used to try and document rules and document requirements and everything else. It just is different. And if you haven't done a sort of top-down decision modeling exercise with business domain experts, then you probably don't realize how different it is. It is, you know, it's really different. That's all I can say. It just is.
Well, I think I see this from the process side, James, as well, is that I'll go into clients and they'll be like, well, let's sit down and start to do some process models. And they're like, well, we're going to go write a requirements document. And it's like, no, stop writing a requirements document. We're going to do a model first, right?
I think
it's kind of that model-driven development.
To take that point one step further, I think that you're never going to get a perfect set of requirements. So perhaps the safest way is to, as quickly as you possibly can, and as an agile approach as you can, using the minimum resources you can, introduce the client to the consequences of their requirements in as harmless a way that you can manage, right? So I'm talking about a kind of ultra CI/CD where you basically you get them to forget their lovely 10-inch thick documents, and you get them to construct something very small that's based on their first thoughts, and then you show them what that might look like, and you try to encourage them that this is an iterative process and you're going to have to keep working at it. But moving towards huge deliverables up front we all know is no answer.
Yeah, and I think to that point, Janet, is that ultimately your validation, as you put it, Fred, really it's an ongoing effort, or it should be an ongoing effort, because you don't know what you don't know. The best way to validate that you've got all of the stuff that you need is you do one bit, you test it. Did that produce the results that people expected? Yes or no? Right. You know, and basically you keep iterating over that, and you get people out of the headspace of, I've defined all of this stuff, now I absolutely have to be sure that that's watertight. You do that test and learn approach. Basically, that's the first thing. And I think in terms of the governance bit, I mean, ultimately that has to be part of your overall architecture and vision for the product. If we're talking in product terms, you know, it's not just about how do you ship something, it's about how do you ship something, take ownership for it, monitor it, what alerting do you put on it, all of which, you know, is likely to be driven by decision services. So yeah, that's why for me it's it's all part of the life cycle of the product as a whole. And it's because essentially the way that I see your particular question, particularly around like the problem definition, is it's not even, it's not even a decision services or decision management question. That is just a product or initiative definition question. How do you make sure that you're actually solving a problem that exists and needs solving? And so, it's kind of, for me, it's business analysis 101. That's kind of my take on it anyway.
Yeah,
Nick,
I think, yeah.
Nick, I like your point about the test and learn there. One of the things that we do is we gather stories now for decisions is ask for what are the test cases that are going to prove we have captured the rules accurately here.
Right. Yeah.
And good. Well, no, what I was going to say was that, I mean, my first piece of advice to you, Fred, would be to buy a copy of Alan Fisher's book and read that, because it's got a tremendous amount of insight. I was never very good at doing requirements analysis, but he's a genius at it. But I think also taking something which I've always kind of found James likes to emphasize. If you're looking at building a decision service, the first thing you need to figure out is what decision you actually want to make. And some of the other questions that you're asking in terms of things like maintenance and so on is what you need to be thinking about there is up front at the very beginning, you want to be asking yourself the question is, if I ask the business what this system, what decisions this system is supposed to make and how it will make them, by the time it goes live, you'll be making the decisions in a different way. Your rules will have changed in some way. They will never be the ones that were there at the beginning of the project. So one of the things that you need to be thinking about very much at the beginning is how is the system going to evolve, because it will. And the whole point of using techniques like DMN is to basically give you a framework which makes that simpler. But that will only work if you have at least some appreciation of the sorts of things that are going to change over time. And it may be things like you're introducing new products, or it may be things that you're introducing new pricing structures, or depending on what your application area is. I mean, if you were doing something like when I was working at Blood and Transport, one of the things there was, we're going to bring in systems which will deal with these organs which people may donate, but in the future we're going to want to bring in some different organs. So we'll start off with hearts and lungs, and we'll move on to kidneys and livers and those sorts of things. So you need to sort of build in to your requirements what the future requirements are going to be in some sense. You can't predict the future, but you should at the beginning have some fairly good guesses as to where it's going to go. So you want to be incorporating those into your analysis and your design and your architecture from the very beginning. Even if you don't know what they're going to look like, you need to have some planning in there, I think.
Well, I think understanding your points of variability so that it's not going to look exactly like it is when you first design it, but at least you kind of understand what are the things that are most likely to change. So you have to make sure that those things are flexible.
Exactly. I mean, the thing is, there are some things you're going to be absolutely certain are going to be changing. And then there are other things which are a bit more speculative, but you kind of build in, you pre-build in the flexibility that you can foresee.
Well, and I think the last year and a half has taught a lot of organizations as well about thinking about flexibility in different ways than they did before. Things that they didn't think could ever changed. And now they're probably rethinking, I think, as we go into the next couple of years of creating, all types of model-driven development, whether it's process models, decision models, whatever. We're going to be looking at, well, we need to have this kind of flexibility because we know that this can change because we saw it change in the last 18 months.
Hopefully this will mean they start building in the continuous improvement as part of the first phase of the project, rather than declaring victory after phase 1 and then a year later going, oh shit, we should have built continuous improvement in. When are we going to do that? And adding it later.
Exactly.
Let's hope.
Okay, well, we're going to have to wrap up the panel. We've already gone a little bit long, but this has been great. I've actually really enjoyed it as well. It's been fun to look at the ways that you're kind of seeing this as the rubber hits the road, and a little bit of my experiences as well. Just taking a look at the schedule for tomorrow. Jacob's going to say a few words to wrap up, but just our schedule for tomorrow. Then we're going to be starting at 9 o'clock Eastern time. I know that's like 6 a.m. for you people on the West Coast, and it's already in the afternoon for those of you in Europe. So it's like on the East Coast, we're in this sort of sweet spot for the time, right? And we're going to be having a long day. We will also have the keynote at noon, noon Eastern time, where we'll go over to the other Zoom session, the declarative AI Zoom session like we did today. I know it's a bit confusing to swap Zooms around, but then we'll have an hour break after that so that we can then come back to this Zoom session again to finish off our afternoon sessions. And we're going to end up with another panel at the end of the day tomorrow with the Ask a Vendor panel instead of the Ask a Practitioner panel. So Jacob, if you'd like to just say a few words and close things off today, and then we'll be all set until tomorrow.
Okay, thank you everybody. And I just listening to this panel, I tried to compare this with similar panels 3 years ago. And probably you would agree with me that it's quite a change. And this change proves that decision management, decision modeling with different technique is really mature technology right now. Problems, what we discuss, they're on different level. Even Mark Woods, who represents real world application, who with his colleague complained 4 or 5 years ago that nobody knows the 3 letters DMN, and today he is talking about completely different use of decision modeling. And we noticed probably the same experience different vendors have, that customers take for granted today use of decision models and build them quite quickly and following great decisioning platforms. So we in much better shape than we used to be, and hopefully this is our common understanding. And I think this was a great first day, and we had great presentation, and I want to thank everybody, and see you tomorrow.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye all.